Live from Fairfax, it's the Inside Scoop, Virginia. All the news Virginians want to know. Here's your host.
Welcome, I'm Bettina Lawton. This is the Inside Scoop, Virginia. And you'll notice there's a little something different going on. We are actually Skyping for the first time, so hopefully I won't confuse everything. David Toscano is with us on the screen from Charlottesville, and he is an expert in Skyping, so if there are any problems with the production tonight, they are all on me. David Toscano is the minority leader in the House of Delegates representing the Democratic Party. He is the delegate from the 57th District, which includes parts of Albemarle County and the city of Charlottesville. He was first elected in 2006 and has been reelected ever since, every 2 years. He has a BA from 1968 from Colgate University in New York. He has a PhD from 1972 at Boston College, and he has a JD from the University of Virginia Law School, which I guess is how we were fortunate enough to get David to Virginia. So welcome to the show, David. I'm glad you could find the time. I know things are a little crazy down there in Richmond these days.
It's great to be with you, and as you know, we're going back real soon to consider whether we're going to pass a budget right away, and also to consider the governor's recommendations on a wide variety of bills that we passed during the General Assembly session that recently concluded.
Now, David, you're on the Courts of Justice Committee, Transportation, which of course is one of our favorite here in Northern Virginia, and the Science and Technology Committees. And you're our first legislature who isn't from Northern Virginia to be on the show. So I wanted to ask you if there are some statewide issues that you think people up here ought to know about that maybe we're not completely tuned into because they're not our issues, and what kind of issues you yourself had in the General Assembly and what happened to the things that you were concerned about.
Well, Bettina, a lot of the issues that you face in your neck of the woods are faced by all parts of the Commonwealth, and they have to do with how adequately we fund our educational system, whether it's K through 12, pre-K, or higher education. You have George Mason in your neck of the woods and a good community college system. And I know that folks in your neck of the woods feel very strongly about investing in public education. We face those problems all over the Commonwealth. It happens that places like Fairfax, because of the composite index, don't get as much from the state as they perhaps should. And so many of the localities end up paying a little bit more of the cost of public education. But funding adequately public education is a huge issue throughout the Commonwealth. Beyond that, of course, transportation. Everybody in Northern Virginia knows about the problems of transportation. That is not unique. Hampton Roads has some very serious problems. And even in our area where traffic congestion isn't that great, we still have some issues with maintenance of bridges and roads that affect everybody who travels in the Commonwealth.
Well, transportation is obviously one of the major concerns up here. And I got an email this afternoon from Senator Mark Herring, who's up in the Lawton part of Northern Virginia, telling me that in the budget that you're going to be considering in a couple of days, there is now no money for the phase 2 of Dulles Rail. And I saw that and thought, how can that happen? We started supposedly with a $150 million commitment from the governor. And then, according to Senator Janet Howell, that commitment had gone up to about $300 million, and now it's to zero. So what's your understanding of how all of that's playing out in the budget?
Well, the latest I'd heard is it was still holding at $150 million. I don't think that every once in a while the governor makes some noises about removing any of the money that would come from the state for the project. We need more money in that project, not less money. I mean, it's the biggest public works project in Virginia. Governing Magazine just yesterday published an article that talked about the 5 largest public-private projects that were going on in the country, and Dulles Rail was ranked there as #1. So wow. You've got to invest the kind of money that is needed to make sure that project goes forward. I think the big issue that we face in terms of the budget process is whether the state government is going to put some more money on the table that will draw down the costs of the tolls for people in Lawton and other places who use the Dulles Toll Road. As you know, the Dulles Toll Road is partly responsible for funding the project, and the extent to which state monies are not placed on the table to help fund it means that the tolling has to pick up the slack. And you're talking about $10, $12 a trip for a toll. If you're living in Lawton, Fairfax, other places where people use that road on a regular basis, you're going to be pretty upset once you start paying those really high tolls. But Dulles isn't the only problem. We have problems with tolling in Hampton roads. And it leads one to believe that we have to focus more closely on a broader-based transportation solution, transportation revenue source that doesn't force people in all these local areas to pay the costs of these tolls.
Well, you know, when Governor McDonald ran for office, he kept saying, oh, you know, I grew up in Fairfax and I understand, and I'm going to make sure that we get a transportation plan. And basically it was a, trust me, we'll do a transportation plan, but there isn't any. It's kind of like naming rights, I guess, is what we're going to rely on, which to me is like, that is not a serious plan. What's going on? Is this just all power politics or what?
Well, what's going on is that a number of people have taken these what are called no tax increase pledges, and Governor McDonald, who's been running for vice president for the last year and a half, has subscribed to it as well. The problem is with transportation, you got to find a dedicated source of revenue, and the governor hasn't exercised the leadership to find it. Last year, he put forward a proposal that basically helped build some additional capacity and conduct some maintenance based on the principle of borrowing money. But we're up against our borrowing limit. And his proposal this year has now ended up being simply naming rights for bridges. And you're not going to raise the kind of money which we need, which is about $1 billion a year to solve our transportation problems in the Commonwealth. I've been in the General Assembly since 2006, and every year there is some kind of crazy patchwork quilt of proposals that are advanced in the General Assembly, and then we find out that most of the public really doesn't want them. When I first got there, it was abusive driver fees. They were going to solve the problem. Last year was bonding. This year it's tolling, and I think that it leads people to think that we need a broader-based source of revenue to solve these problems.
Well, David, do you have any suggestions for that? Because I know I think we've tried to increase the gas tax, which hasn't been raised since 1986, I guess. And there were some other, Chet Peterson was here talking about some kind of an indexing thing that he had put forward, but nothing is getting through.
Well, the problem is you're not going to get anything through until you get leadership from the governor's office, because the way everything is configured in the House of Delegates now, it's largely controlled by very conservative legislators, largely from rural districts, who don't really appreciate the problems that you have in Northern Virginia with road building and maintenance. And they control the roost down there, and they are loath to increase any kind of revenue source that will help pay for new roads. The only way that will change is Governor McDonald has to step up and say, look, I'm not enthused about raising taxes. I'm not enthused about raising fees, but we've got to do something. And whether indexing of the gas tax may be part of the solution, or whether it should be an increase in the gas tax generally, or whether it should be an increase in the sales tax, or perhaps some combination of things. But, you know, there's no free lunch out there. We have critical needs in education. The governor has proposed taking some of the money from education and putting it in transportation, but I'm not sure that my constituents would want that, and I don't think your constituents would want it either. No. So we're left with no leadership at the top that will put forward a solution that really works, that puts enough money on the table.
And as a basic proposition, I'm assuming that unless, we got no hopes until next year. We've got to get through the Republican convention because, as you say, Governor McDonald has basically been running for the vice presidential slot, although I read that's really not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to say, oh, no, you know, I don't really want to do it. But we need to get past that because it's an issue of taxes, and he's not, I have a hard time thinking he's going to show any kind of leadership that would require additional taxes as long as he's aiming for that vice presidential slot.
Well, I think that's probably true. But again, sometimes the test of leadership is to stand up to folks who maybe had supported you in the past and say, look, I've learned something during my 2.5 years in the governor's mansion. I've learned that we do not have a dedicated revenue source that's going to solve this problem. And I'm going to be the one who takes the bull by the horns and decide to do something that no governor has done since 1986 with Governor Belial's, and that is to raise a revenue source that can help solve our transportation problems.
Well, you had mentioned that we borrowed. Last year we borrowed a couple $2 billion, as I recall, to do transportation stuff. And you'd mentioned that we were now at our limit. Are we now in a position where if we try to do this through borrowing, which I'm not a big fan of, sort of borrow and spend as opposed to tax and spend, they sort of come out the same, that we are not going to be able to do it without jeopardizing our AAA credit rating? I mean, how does that all play out?
Well, Bettina, I mean, you know, when you mortgage your house, you've got to show to the bank that you've got a revenue source to pay it back. And that's the same true with road borrowing too. It's okay to borrow the money, but you got to have a source to pay it back. And right now we're running out of sources to pay it back, and so it doesn't make sense for us to just borrow to pay for roads. At some point you begin to look like the federal government, and that's something that I don't think Virginians really want or appreciate. So we're going to have to find another revenue source to help fund either borrowing or direct investment year by year in a real capital improvement program that's going to solve these problems. I mean, the other good thing about spending on transportation, it gets money in the economic pipeline really quickly. It pays for really good jobs that pay a decent wage and helps with the local circulation of money that helps our local economies. Sometimes we forget about that. It's a good source of jobs, and it'd be a good way that we could keep our economy moving forward.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and hopefully somebody's going to figure this out, or we'll just have to wait till we get a new governor. How's that?
Well, yeah, you may see, I got to believe that transportation is going to be a major issue in the next gubernatorial race, because even though Governor McDonald said he would solve the problem, he really has just kicked the can down the road.
Well, we're going to take a pause here because we have to go to break. Stay with us. We'll be back with David Toscano.
Some dreams are universal. Dreams that inspire us. Multiple sclerosis is a devastating disease that changes lives forever. The National MS Society does more for people with MS than any organization in the world. But we can't do it alone. To get involved, visit us online at nationalmssociety.org or call 1-800-FIGHT-MS. This is why we're here. Because nobody dreams of having multiple sclerosis.
What's wrong with this picture? Half of young Americans can't locate economic powers like Japan and India. 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. Without geography, our children aren't ready for the world. Geography is everywhere. It's incredible creatures, rhythm, fashion, flavor. It's economics and politics. It's change. Understanding connections between people and places is critical in the 21st century. That's why we created mywonderfulworld.org. Go there now for your free parent and teacher action kits and give our kids the power of global knowledge. Because kids who understand our world today can succeed in it tomorrow.
Here again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton, your host, and I have with me tonight via Skype David Toscano. He is a delegate in the Virginia General Assembly, and he is the minority leader, which in Virginia means he's a Democrat. So, David, we were talking about transportation when we left, and I think we've sort of concluded that maybe we need a new governor, new senators, new House of Delegate, if we're going to get anywhere, because we're certainly not getting anywhere at the moment. So let's leave that. Today is the 5th anniversary of the massacre down at Virginia Tech. And for those people who maybe didn't live in Virginia at the time, because if you did live here, you clearly would remember it, we lost 32 of our young people and professors at Virginia Tech when a person opened fire and all these folks died. Virginia 20 years ago was known as the gun running capital on the East Coast. A lot of our guns ended up in New York somehow, and there's all this kinds of stuff, and now there's these Mayor Against Guns or something organizations. And so people were a little surprised, a little disheartened, at least people in Northern Virginia were, at the gun legislation that went through this year, the repeal of the one handgun a month. And what I saw on some surveys that were done by the Richmond Times-Dispatch was that 66% of Virginians from all parts of the state thought we ought to keep the one handgun a month rule, but it got repealed anyway. What was all going on with that? Was just that totally National Rifle Association stuff, David, or how did that happen?
Well, Bettina, you know, it's interesting you mentioned the tech shootings and the anniversary. One of the things, I mean, if you look at what happened in the aftermath, Governor Kane really made his mark as a conciliatory and yet strong leader in the aftermath of Virginia Tech. He won great kudos for how he handled that massacre. And to the credit of the General Assembly, some of our best work we've done in a bipartisan way had to do with finding some more money for mental health spending in the aftermath of the Tech shooting and revising some of our laws in mental health area. Now, you know, that being said, a couple of years later, when we had problems with the budget, a lot of that mental health funding went away. And now what you've got is a lot of new pro-gun legislation that it seems to allow people to carry guns more places and own more guns. And it's creating, I think, a problem for many people in more urbanized areas who say, hey, wait a minute, this is just too much. The repeal of one gun a month is an indication of that. But we also had 28 single gun-related bills that came before us that would have extended people's ability to carry guns into airports. There had been a proposal to allow people to carry guns on college campuses. Mm-hmm. There was a proposal to arm Medicaid fraud investigators as they went into nursing homes to search for fraud. There seems like again and again and again, there are more gun bills that are before the General Assembly, and a lot of them passed. There was a bill that would prevent localities from having workplace rules that would prohibit people from carrying their guns onto the locality's parking lots. And a lot of these things are passing, and people are beginning to wonder, what's this about? Well, what it's about is social overreach in the legislative arena, largely by conservative Republicans in the House of Delegates, but also backed up by a more conservative state Senate of Virginia and signed by a fairly conservative governor, Governor McDonnell. How this is going to play itself out at the polls is yet to be known. I think the polls, the polling data that you see indicate that the public are not enamored of this legislation. And we'll just see whether they think they should keep the delegates in who supported that legislation next year in the general election.
Well, I think that's something that's absolutely critical, because we keep saying it to folks, elections have consequences. And if you elect people who have a history of being conservative, and when in the last, 2 years ago when there were the elections, we kept saying to folks, these are really conservative people you're electing. And of course, they were running on a no, I'm a moderate platform, but they weren't, and they aren't. And people need to understand that just because someone decides to say, for purposes of an election, that they're moderate, that doesn't mean that's how they're going to govern. And hopefully people will realize, particularly with the handguns, I mean, I understand people who are hunters or people who are collectors or whatever, who want to be able to buy however many they want to buy. But these are handguns. This is not, I'm not taking a handgun and going out deer hunting with it. So I really do hope that people remember this and do hold people accountable. I did see, and this somewhat surprised me, there was a posting on Facebook this morning by Delegate Ken Plum, who made a reference to the fact that the Stand Your Ground law that has raised such issues with what happened down with Trayvon Martin in Florida, that had almost made it through the Virginia legislature, and I had no idea that that was out there. I thought that when they talked about the Castle doctrine, they were just talking about the right to defend yourself in your home. But Ken tells me that that was actually much broader, and that the references to saying, oh, we're just codifying this common law, defend your home doctrine is not it, that it was really a stand your ground kind of legislation. Is that your understanding of what that was? Because that totally passed me right by.
Well, I haven't looked at the Florida statute, but my understanding about the Stand Your Ground Florida statute was that it allowed people to defend themselves with lethal force independent of being in their home. Right. So that's why you heard this defense out there that he was standing his ground even though he wasn't inside his home. The Castle Doctrine debate that occurred in the General Assembly was very interesting politically because we have had a common law rule for years in Virginia. And remember, even our Constitution acknowledges that we support English common law. And that English common law stated that if somebody crossed your threshold in your house and was designed to lethally harm you, you could respond in kind. The key was proportionality. I mean, you couldn't shoot somebody just because they came in and wanted to throw a plate at you. You had to be able to show that you were defending yourself. So the bill came forward this year, and what it did was try to codify the English common law, make it part of the statute of Virginia. It was supported by the National Rifle Association. But interestingly enough, a number of other more conservative gun groups opposed that change in the statute. And so even though that change never occurred in Virginia this year, the reason it was defeated is not because the moderate and the left stood up and said, we don't like this, and the legislators listened to us. The reason it was defeated was that the more conservative gun lobbyists decided they didn't like the legislation. So I would expect that you'll see something again next year to revise the Castle Doctrine and make it part of the code. We've seen these bills every year. Typically, they've been shot down in the state Senate, but this year they would have passed but for the conservatives opposing the bill, ultimately in the House and in the Senate.
Now, do you think that they opposed it, David, because it didn't go far enough? Or, I mean, that's kind of like counterintuitive to think that it's the conservative members opposing a gun legislation. That's not what you usually think. Was it just not, I don't know how to phrase it, was the legislation not liberal enough for them, or was not, how does that work?
I think they concluded, and this, of course, you're getting the inside scoop here, right?
That's what the show is.
But I think they concluded that they would have been they were better off with the English common law than with a statute that might make it more difficult for them to do what they wanted to do. But that's just conjecture. All we saw were these emails from these very conservative guns rights organizations saying, don't support this bill. This is not a good bill. This is not good for gun owners. And that's why it went down.
Well, since we're talking sort of about lobbyists and influence peddlers and things like that, let me talk about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, I think is its official name, because that's been in the news lately. Speaker Howell got into some difficulty last Friday, I think it was, in a news conference where he was defending ALEC. And for those people who haven't followed this, Alex apparently writes a lot of legislation, and I've seen, depending on the source, 50 or 60 bills identified as having been introduced by Republicans in the General Assembly that were actually written by Alex. And a number of people say this is not a good group, that they have corporate members. A lot of them started leaving because they are also apparently the authors of the Stand Your Ground bill down in Florida. And so they've been losing corporate sponsors, corporate members recently because of that controversy. But what's your view? Do you see the Alex people around? I know there are lots of different House of Delegate members who are members of Alex. Apparently, the state has spent over $200,000 sending different legislators to their meetings and things like that. What's your view of how appropriate it is to have somebody not on the payroll of Virginia taxpayers or part of our General Assembly structure writing legislation for us? Is that common? Are people making a big deal out of nothing?
Well, Bettina, there are a lot of questions embedded in that.
Yeah, there are.
Let me tell you, ALEC is, of course, a very conservative organization, and it was formed, I don't know how many years ago, but it was designed really to push a national conservative agenda, conservative in terms of economic philosophy, conservative in terms of social policy, conservative in terms of environmental issues and regulatory issues. What we've been seeing over the last few years is more and more bills that have been essentially taken out of the ALEC playbook and simply slapped down in Virginia as if they would apply to Virginia. That's really not the way to write legislation. We're unique in Virginia. If a legislator has an idea about something that should happen, or a locality thinks something should happen, or an interest group thinks something should happen, let us draft the legislation. Let our fine legislative services organization draft the legislation. Let's tailor it to Virginia. We shouldn't have these outside groups coming in and trying to influence our legislative process. And I think that's the case with ALEC. And I hope that we'll begin to ask more and more questions about the source of this kind of legislation. You know, I had to laugh. I heard a story the other day. I almost think it might have been in Virginia, but it could have been in another state, where a legislator plunked down one of these ALEC bills and didn't bother to change the name of the state.
Oh.
So it got introduced that had the wrong state in it, and clearly it showed that these folks are really not looking at this legislation. It's just all part of this agenda that they have to push a conservative ideology.
Well, stay with us, because we're going to come back and talk some more with David Toscano.
This year, 28,000 Americans will be diagnosed with oral cancer. Every year, 7,000 Americans die of oral cancer.
I'm Eva Cohen, and I'm an oral cancer survivor. I didn't fit the profile. I didn't smoke or drink. I had no family history of cancer, no family history of cancer. I was 31 years old. 31 years old. I went to see my dentist about a sore in my mouth that wouldn't heal. It was oral cancer. I had to have a radical neck dissection and a portion of my tongue reconstructed. I didn't know if I was going to live or die.
I'm Surgeon General Richard Carmona. The survival rate for oral cancer is only 50%. Oral cancer can happen to anyone. If you have a sore or lesion in your mouth that doesn't heal within 2 weeks, see your dentist. Early detection is the key.
Early detection saves lives. I know.
1 in 8 Americans goes hungry. One idea helped change that. A community started a garden that blossomed into farmers markets. 1 in 6 children lives in poverty. One group of women found an answer by opening a daycare center that their neighbors could afford. Today, 36 million Americans live in poverty. But one by one, people are helping themselves and each other to change the picture of poverty to one of hope. For easy ways you can help, visit povertyusa.org.
2 words for you. Pop quiz. Ready? Name any funny movie. A drama. Name a mystery. And one more thing. Name the movie your kids saw today in science class.
Know what really matters. Know about your kid's school. And know about your kid. Find out 100 ways to know more, do more.
Here again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton, your host, and I have with me tonight David Toscano, who is the minority leader in the House of Delegates in the Virginia General Assembly. And David, I wanted to talk about the budget. You guys are coming back in a couple days or maybe tomorrow, actually, to vote on the budget. Where does that actually stand? People are saying that you got a good compromise, you don't have any compromises. What's the inside scoop on that?
The inside scoop. Okay, well, let's start at the beginning, and that's when Governor McDonnell introduced his budget in December. For those of us interested in K through 12 education, for those of us interested in making sure those most vulnerable are protected in this time of economic challenge, the governor's budget was not very good. It had draconian cuts in the social safety net, and it didn't provide the level of educational funding that we really need to keep our students able to compete in an increasingly global, complex global economy. So Democrats in the House and Democrats in the Senate started pushing right away. We said, look, we got to boost up the money for education. We've got to make sure that the social safety net is protected. And as a result, we got a House budget that was a lot better than Governor McDonnell's budget. Once that budget got to the Senate after some fits and starts, the Senate layered on top of it some additional good things that I think would be very helpful to folks in Northern Virginia, particularly some extra money to help fund what y'all call the cost to compete. That's the additional money that comes to certain parts of the state, primarily in Northern Virginia, to help school divisions be able to recruit and retain the best teachers, because otherwise the cost of living makes it very difficult for people to live in parts of Northern Virginia. There wasn't enough money in the governor's budget. In fact, he eliminated cost to compete, and there wasn't any money in the House budget. But the Senate budget had that money in it. The Senate budget also had money to draw down the cost of the tolls for the Dulles project, and had some money to help with the cost of tolls in Hampton Roads. So it was a much better budget than the House budget, and a number of us, when we had a chance to vote on the Senate budget, got up and extolled the virtues of the Senate budget and tried to get it passed. That was several weeks ago. The Republicans in the House said no, they didn't want to pass that budget, and so it went into conference. Now what we've got is a conference report that we're not sure that Senate Democrats are going to support. And remember, you need a majority of senators to support the conference report on the budget. Otherwise, there is no budget. So we're going to see tomorrow whether there are enough votes to support it. And if not, there'll probably be another conference on the budget, and we'll have to work through some problems. Eventually, we will get to have a budget. We'll have it. We have to have it by July 1st, because that's the end of the fiscal year and the beginning of the next. But we'll get one.
There was a lot of criticism today on the blogs and in the paper that Governor McDonnell had sent out, or his Secretary of Transportation had sent out a notice to the contractors working on the road saying, you need to be ready to start shutting down. And this hadn't happened in the past 2 times that we didn't have a budget at this point in time, and it seemed like a big pressure tactic, although they said, oh, well, we had to do this. How much of this kind of grandstanding continues to go on? Are the Republicans looking at this as an opportunity to say, see, the Democrats don't really care, this is all power politics again, and trying to leverage it against the Democrats because the Democrats in the Senate were the ones who said, no, this isn't an acceptable budget when the House budget came over? Or what kind of sense do you get of that? How far are they willing to go? Are we going to be, like the federal government in 96 or whatever it was, when Newt Gingrich shut it down?
We can't be in that position. I think the Republicans right now are scurrying around to try to gain whatever leverage they can to put pressure on Senate Democrats to vote for this budget. And we're going to see tomorrow if it's going to work. And when we had these problems several years ago, and I remember the first year I was down in Richmond, that was 2006, we went 102 days into overtime before we got a budget. It was the second year of a biennium, it was 102 days before we got a budget, and as far as I recall, I don't think there was any announcement that things would start winding down May 1st. So I think it is a scare tactic, and I think we will get a budget, and it'll be a lot better than Governor McDonnell's budget. It'll be a lot better than the budget was passed out of the House. It'll be closer, I think, to the budget that was passed the first time around in the Senate, and hopefully we'll get it sooner rather than later.
So for the cost to compete funds, and you're absolutely right, those of us in Northern Virginia think those are absolutely essential funds. Initially, I think we were looking at $65 million that we wanted. I don't think we got that. Is that still in the budget based on the conference report or the information that you've seen?
It's still in the budget. It's not as much as I think folks in your area wanted. Folks in my area, I'm from Charlottesville, right? It has a very high cost of living here. And a lot of people argue to me that, hey, we should have cost to compete too. We have not been fortunate enough to get that, and I don't know that we ever will, but it has been a really important staple in the methods that you have to recruit good teachers and firefighters and public safety people and keep them. And I think a lot of us who are downstate understand that, and we Democrats in the House have supported that fully because we think it's important to help out parts of the Commonwealth who don't necessarily have the same interests as we do, because we are a Commonwealth.
Well, that I always say to people, there is a reason why we're called a Commonwealth and not a state. I'm not sure people quite get the distinction these days. Let me ask you, because there was an education issue that Governor McDonnell was real hot to trot on, which was increasing the number of slots for Virginia students at the Virginia universities, because as you know, but maybe some of our listeners don't, the out-of-state students pay a much higher tuition than the in-state students, and there's a huge pushback and controversy saying, my kid, I'm coming out of Fairfax, my kid's got a 4.0, great LSATs or SATs, I guess, and I can't get them into Virginia, UVA. And there was a big push by the governor and some of the Republicans to say we need to allow more students in, which, as I understood it, would have required a lot more money to the higher education piece in order to allow that to happen. Are those slots in the budget? Is there more higher education money?
Well, the good news in the budget, in both, actually in Governor McDonnell's budget and the House budget and the Senate budget, is there's more money for higher education than we put in probably 10 years. We have been under-investing in higher education for a long time, and it's beginning to show. And part of the way it shows is in terms of number of people who think their students should get it, their children should get in to places like UVA, but there are not enough slots. And so part of the money that's is being used to create more slots. Now, we have this goal. It's called Grow by Degrees, and the goal was 100,000 new degrees in 10 years. Well, we're not putting enough money in there to get it. The new money that's going in this year is going to create some more slots, but it's not going to create what we need to hit the target of 100,000 more. And you try telling a parent of a student anywhere, whether they're in Fairfax or whether they're in Virginia Beach, that when their student has a 4.0 and they can't get into UVA, they say, well, I don't understand that. And that hurts. And I understand, but until we create more money for higher education, we're probably not going to get more slots. And when out-of-state students pay a larger percentage of the cost of education, there's going to be a big push to get some of those folks into elite institutions like UVA. That's still a great minority of the students at UVA are from out of state, but it doesn't help with the family member who's trying to get their youngster in.
Yeah, that's actually surprising to me, because you listen to the folks who say, I can't get my kid in, and you would think the majority of the people at UVA were out of state. I didn't realize that the majority are still Virginians.
It's in excess of 74%, I think, of UVA students are still in-state students.
That's actually pretty good from my perspective.
And a large number come from Northern Virginia.
Well, of course, because we have a fabulous school system up here,
Great
David.
school divisions all around there.
I wonder about, you know, the Republicans in there, we're not going to increase taxes pledge. And now we have a budget where that won't happen. But it seems to me a lot of costs are getting shifted down to the localities. And I saw an article just this morning in the News Ledger about what was happening with some of the counties, actually mid-state rural type counties, we're not talking Fairfax here, who were saying that they would have to increase their real property taxes by up to 20% in order to actually fully fund all of these mandates that are coming down from Richmond. In an era when the Republicans are constantly yelling at the federal government about unfunded mandates, isn't there some recognition in Richmond that the only way you're getting to say, hey, we didn't raise any taxes, is because it's the real property taxes that are getting raised. It's the localities that are getting hit. There's no reality about this? How can this be?
Well, you know, part of it is that you've got a large majority in the House of Delegates who've taken this no tax increase pledge, and they don't even want to even think about raising a fee, let alone a tax. But yeah, you're actually right, Bettina. Somebody ultimately pays the piper, and when you are in a rural area where your tax base isn't all that great and it's not that diverse, if you're not getting money from Richmond, and you've got to pay for services for your constituents, you have no other option but the real estate tax. So even though the people in Richmond say, well, we didn't raise your taxes, indirectly they are raising their taxes because people are coming up with the money at the local level. You were talking, I think, about Waynesboro, Stanton, and Augusta, which are the three areas right next door to me. And you know, those folks really want to support their school division, but they don't have enough money from Richmond to do it. And so they have to consider raising their real estate property tax. And you find that in a lot of places around the Commonwealth now. You see different places raising those taxes because there's not enough money from Richmond. And the same thing is happening with transportation dollars.
Well, isn't that the devolution theory that we're going to have the state, which to my mind, it's a transportation system. It's a state responsibility, and they're turning around and saying, well, we're going to give that back to the localities, but we're not going to give you the money to maintain it. And again, localities only have that real property tax. So I'm not sure how that works. But we're going to come back. We're going to talk a little bit about that in our last segment. And we're going to talk about some other legislation that got some amendments and see where we stand on that. So I want you to all stay with us because we will be back after the break with David Toscano to finish up talking about the General Assembly.
There's more than just books at the library.
There's more than just books at the library.
Excuse me. There's more than just books at the library.
Il y a plus que de livres à la bibliothèque.
Hello. You have a lot of great books here today. You know there's more than just books at the library.
I know.
There's more than just books at the library.
I don't want to be hooked to a machine.
I want all the medical treatment available to me.
I wouldn't want my family to have to make this decision.
My doctor knows what's best for me.
An advance directive is your life on your terms. Talk with your family. Decide what's right for you. Then put it in writing.
Documenting my wishes today means my family won't have to make heart-wrenching decisions later.
To learn more, visit www.putitinwriting.org.
1,200 American youth run away from their homes every day. The National Runaway Switchboard is here to help. 1-800-RUNAWAY. If you are a runaway, thinking about running away from home, or a parent or guardian concerned about issues facing your child, call us 24 hours a day. 1-800-RUNAWAY. In times of crisis, hope is just a phone call away. 1-800-RUNAWAY.
Here again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back for our final segment with Inside Scoop, Virginia. We have David Toscano with us tonight. And when we left, we were talking about devolution, giving localities the responsibility for their roads. And I wondered if that happens, does that allow localities, for example, to decide to set up tolls on their roads? Would that be a way they could fund it, or does the state continue to sort of dictate what can happen on toll roads? Because it seems to me, if you want a user fee, toll roads are the way that that's done. Is that something in terms of in the thought process of how are they, local people, going to fund this, or this doesn't have a thought process with it?
Well, sometimes I wonder if the things we do have a thought process associated with it. But, you know, if you're going to think about devolution in a serious way, you're going to have to give localities much more flexibility in how they raise revenue. Right now, localities only have limited ways to raise revenue. Cities can raise revenue easier than counties. A lot of things that counties do have to have referendum and all kinds of other things and state authority. So without, if you're going to devolve the road responsibility to localities, you have to give them more flexibility in how they raise revenue, and you probably have to give them some more revenue. Otherwise, the localities are really going to take a hit, and local property tax payers are going to really feel the pinch. What's happening in a lot of these rural areas, and you don't experience it as much in your area, but I think Fairfax probably has a public works department, and they probably raise a lot of their own money for roads, but you're finding that's more and more the case in rural areas. And a place like Augusta County, again, a rural county that is adjacent to Albemarle, which I represent, has put money in their capital budget every year for roads, and they never used to do it. But they have to do it because they can't maintain their roads otherwise. And I think you're seeing it more and more around the Commonwealth.
Well, that is something that I've noticed when I was raised in upstate New York, and when I would go back there, the roads would be horrible. I mean, they just don't invest in their roads particularly. And I always thought, this is great. You know, Virginia, we're really keeping the place together and we're investing in ourselves. And I don't see that. And I think that's, Republicans always talk about taxes, but it's an investment. It's an investment in our schools and in our transportation. And you know what? I'm preaching to the choir here, aren't I?
Well, you are. And of course, different places have different needs. I mean, you go into a rural area in Virginia and drive on those roads, and people say, well, gee, why do we need to raise more revenue to help people in Northern Virginia? And I say to them, well, look, Northern Virginia helps fund your school division. The money that's being generated out of the economic powerhouse that is Northern Virginia gets sent to Richmond, and then it gets sent out to a lot of these rural areas who otherwise wouldn't have the level of school funding that they get. And I've been trying to convince my rural colleagues that that's a good reason why they should try to invest more in transportation, even though they won't necessarily show up on their roads the way it would in terms of Northern Virginia and the new roads that need to get built in your area.
Well, we up in Northern Virginia tend to look at that as a redistribution of wealth, which I had always thought Republicans were really not into. But apparently when they're redistributing someone else's wealth, it's okay. Let me talk about the Virginia retirement system. You were quoted someplace I saw because the changes were pushed through at the very end. And you were quoted that it was a leap of faith, and it's not a leap of faith you should take blindly. And you've now had some time since the end of session when that thing had to be voted on. What's your view of the changes? And again, from what I've read, this is another one of those things where a bunch of the cost is now being sent down to the localities. But what's your view of the changes to the Virginia retirement system?
Well, we do things too quickly down in Richmond sometimes, and changing something as big, as major as the Virginia retirement system should not be done in an hour or two. And that's exactly what happened at the end of the session. Now, since that time, as we found out, there were a lot of technical errors in the bill, and those had to be corrected. But independent of the technical errors, there's some real questions about forcing the costs of this down onto localities and onto individual employees. And the risk is that not that people who retire next year or the year after that aren't going to get as pretty close to what their benefits would have been had these changes not occurred, because they probably will. It's more like what's going to happen to the new people coming on, and will the retirement system be of a nature that it can encourage the hiring and the retention of those new people, and whether we're going to have essentially a two-tiered workforce where newer people aren't going to get the level of benefits that folks who have been in the system longer. And that breeds a lot of resentment and create some pretty serious problems morale-wise for people down the road. The key to the solving of this problem is not these bills that we've been passing. The key is to invest the money in the retirement system to draw down what's called the unfunded liability, so everybody can have their promises that we've made to them honored when they retire from the system.
Well, isn't the VRS the system that last year we borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars from, or is that some different retirement system? Because it seemed to me that's how we balanced the budget last year, was borrowing like $600 million and then declaring we had a surplus of 400.
Well, we basically didn't fund it the way we were supposed to fund it. You know, some people say we borrowed on the system. Some people say we just didn't invest. Long and short of it is the money wasn't put in the system. And when you don't put the money in the system, your investments aren't as large and they can't grow as large. If you can imagine, if we'd put that money in the system and some of it had been in equities in the stock market over the last year, as the run-up has occurred, our unfunded liability would have gone way down because the value of our investment in the VRS would have gone way up. But because we're not doing that, it's like any savings. The savings you make 20 years ago are compounding themselves. And if you're not saving enough, you don't have as much money as you otherwise would have had you saved way back when. And that's been the problem with VRS. We just haven't put the money in, and now it's coming back to haunt us.
Well, let me ask you about a totally different bill. And we've had a number of shows about this in the past because it's a big issue, and that's what the Democrats call voter suppression bills. The Republicans call them voter ID bills. And apparently, from what I read in the paper, Governor McDonald has done some amendments to the bill that passed. And question comes up, is the House of Delegates and the Senate going to accept those amendments? They basically broadened the types of IDs that could be presented at the polling place. And amazingly, they did a poll recently to say to people, do you need to bring a voter photo ID? And a lot of people think that's what's required. But as I read the statute, that's not required. Is the General Assembly going to go along with the governor's amendments?
Well, good question. My guess is they will, because they already voted for a bill that was worse. And so I guess you could say the governor's amendment makes it less bad. But you have to ask yourself the question, the primary question, what are we trying to solve here? There's been no indication that there's any kind of serious voter fraud in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And yet we have this bill out there that's going to make it more difficult for people to vote. So you sort of say, what's the point? And now you look at the governor's amendments. The governor's amendments take us back closer to where we were before. And you say to yourself, well, you know, if we're pretty close to where we were before, you know, why not just veto the bill? There's no reason to have it in the first place. It just makes it more difficult for people to vote. And, you know, I didn't vote for the bill before, and I'm going to vote for it now, but it's a little marginally better than it was when it came out of the House and the Senate.
Yeah, I sort of looked at it, and the one thing that people keep talking about is you have to vote a provisional ballot if you don't bring one of this huge list of documents. So it would seem that a lot of this is an education process that says to folks, you have to bring something to the polling place, whether it's your driver's license, if you don't have one of those, it's your utility bill, your phone bill, your college ID, public college ID. But people need to understand that you can't just walk in. I know in my polling place I have somebody who comes every year after they've been jogging. They never have ID. So we need to make sure we reach out to those folks to make sure that, assuming that the legislation does go into effect, that we don't have people disenfranchised when we could avoid it. So hopefully we'll get all that information out to the public. Let me ask you how this works. HB1, the infamous HB1, which is the personhood bill, which confers on a fetus the status of person. And it passed the House of Delegates, and it got sent back to committee in the Senate. I think when they realized there were something like 26,000 references to persons in the Virginia statutes, and nobody had thought to say, how is this bill going to affect all of that? It went back to the Senate committee. But as I understand it, that can all come back up again next year. And how does that work? It made it through the House of Delegates. Does it have to go back there again? Does a new bill have to be introduced? What do we need to look for on the HB1?
Well, I think you're going to see it again one way or the other. I mean, potentially it could get considered by a Senate committee and then go right to the Senate next year, because the bill is not dead. People think that bill's dead. It is not dead. It is very much alive. I think a lot of the Republicans are very worried about this bill because it creates all kinds of mischief. I heard the joke the other day, if you're driving an HOV lane, HOV2, and you're a single mom, but you're pregnant and it's just you and your fetus in the car, and you get stopped by a police officer and you claim, hey, look, I got two people in this car, don't stop me. But I mean, that's an indication of the unintended consequence of a bill like this, where people really haven't thought it through. As you said, how many thousands of places is the word person used in the code? It's going to be a wonderful thing for lawyers. I mean, I could create a whole practice based on this personhood bill. I think you're going to see it again because there are certain members of the General Assembly who want it passed, including, I think, our Attorney General. So it's not going away.
Well, and that's, I think, one of the things that we need to make sure people realize, because as you say, there is the misunderstanding that the bill is dead, and it's not dead. And the folks who were down protesting and concerned about that need to continue to pay attention next year when it comes back up again, unless they want to see it happen again. We are coming to the very end, so give me a quick 10 seconds of what you want people to pay attention to over the next couple of days when you're back in session.
Well, watch very carefully what we do with the budget. Either we're going to get one, or we're going to have a big fight about tolls and for the Dulles Toll Road and in Hampton Roads. And it's all about the future of Virginia. Are we going to try to solve our transportation problems, or are we not?
And there you have it from David Toscano. Thanks, David, for being here.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.